Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I of course thought that I would give my little fight prediction and my fight preview, my little fight analysis before the fight does end up happening. And I do apologize for this being so late. I really actually was not planning on doing a fight prediction on this, but I thought that I would do it because I thought that it would be very particularly interesting to talk about. But this fight, of course, overall, for those of you that don't know what is going to occur tomorrow, Jake Paul, of course, the former YouTube wonder, as with his brother Logan Paul, and some of these YouTubers, of course, that have gotten into the professional sport of boxing. Overall, Jake Paul has his first fight against that overall of a professional boxer by the name of Tommy Fury. And of course, Tommy Fury is a part of the rich boxing history family known as the Furies. Of course, you know John Fury, who once upon a time was a former boxer. Nothing overall too special in the sport. But of course, what the Furies are mainly known for is the Gypsy King, Mr. Tyson Fury, who, of course, in my opinion, is one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, and at the current moment in time, the best heavyweight on the planet Earth. Just is what it is. But this is going to be a very particularly interesting fight for a multitude of reasons. First off, Jake Paul, once again, I always find his events a little bit entertaining, and not everyone is going to agree with that statement because there are certain people that really don't take his events seriously. They may say that they're quote unquote fake, or they may say all in all that he's not really fighting professional boxers. And what I will say is this: the Tyron Woodley rematch overall with the twisted wrist and that sign, that did appear like that certainly could have been faked. But do I believe that the Anderson Silva or the first Tyron Woodley fight, do I believe that those fights were fixed? No, I don't. I just think that Jake Paul, in terms of his boxing IQ, that he's above those guys. And certain people may take a look at me and they'll say, "You're absolutely crazy. That's absolutely delusional." But at the end of the day, Jake Paul was able to win those fights. Once again, I've always stated this: MMA fighters in a boxing match, they're not usually going to beat a professional boxer, and boxers in an MMA fight, excuse me, overall, they're not usually going to beat the boxer because they're both somewhat of martial arts, but they're completely different. Their movements are different. Their footwork is way different. Their head movements are different. The way that they strike is different. It's just completely different. You can't do certain things overall in MMA that you would do in boxing because you're going to get hit with certain legs or, leg kicks, or you're going to get hit overall with certain kicks possibly to the head or somewhere else, or you're going to get hit with certain knees or other personal strikes, or get taken down to the ground. And you can't strike the same way in boxing that you would in MMA because a lot of the times their stances, they usually tend to be a little bit more flat-footed. They usually tend overall to be a little bit more stiff with their head, which at times sometimes they have to be because once again, they can't run into certain kicks when it comes down to it, or knees, so it's understandable. And they tend to fight a little bit taller. But a lot of people, of course, they make the point overall to where they say, well, I'm not really too impressed with Jake Paul. And I was just talking about this with my friend as of yesterday. And he claimed overall, well, I don't really take Jake Paul that seriously. He overall hasn't beaten any professional boxers. When he beats a professional boxer, then I'll be impressed. And I certainly understand where people are coming from. But the fact that Jake Paul has actually been able to do what he's been able to do, I have to give him a hell of a lot of credit. And not everyone is going to agree with me on that statement. Once again, I had a friend overall that I was talking to yesterday, and he said, well, he's not really actually beating any boxers. He's just beating MMA fighters. And what my friend compared it to, which I didn't think was really a good comparison, but what he compared it to was that would be like LeBron James beating Lionel Messi in a basketball game and then bragging about how he beat one of the best athletes in a basketball game. Well, I understand a little bit where he's coming from, but I don't think that you can really make that comparison. Because just to talk about that comparison, to make that comparison, you would have to debate that Jake Paul at one point in time was debated as one of the best boxers in the world. And no one has ever debated that Jake Paul was one of the best or the greatest boxers in the world. LeBron James at one point in time was looked at as the clear best basketball player of his generation. And Lionel Messi has been looked at as the clear best soccer player or football player of his generation. Jake Paul has never ever been looked at overall as the best of his generation. He's never even gotten into the ring with a real professional boxer. So the fact overall that Jake Paul has actually been able to do what he's been able to do, That's not me saying overall that it's as impressive as what other professional boxers have done, but it's more than what a lot of other people, especially average people or former YouTubers, could do. Because a lot of people at one point in time did not even believe that he really stood a relative chance against certain fighters like that of a Ben Askren or a Tyron Woodley or an Anderson Silva. A lot of people predicted Jake Paul to lose these fights. I personally predicted him to win them. Because Jake Paul, one thing I'll say about him is this: no, he's not a Canelo Alvarez. He's not a Terrence Bud Crawford. He's not a Tyson Fury. He's not a Vasily Lomachenko or whoever the hell else you want to compare him to. Errol Spence Jr., whoever you think is, elite great. Manny Pacquiao, Floyd Mayweather Jr. No, he's none of those guys. But what Jake Paul is, in my opinion, for the little amount of training and professional boxing training that he has had, he's a very decently talented guy, at least for what he's able to do. Now, once again, in my opinion, is he going to beat a Canelo Alvarez or someone on the know that is a top 10 pound for pound fighter? No, in my opinion, he's not going to. But I do see Jake Paul, in my opinion, being more skilled overall each fight that I see him getting into. I've seen him improve a little bit in the Tyron Woodley fights. I've seen him overall using his jab and his lead hand a little bit better. His defense is getting a decent amount better, especially up against the ropes, and he's starting to learn how to handle himself up against the ropes a little bit better. He still has a little bit of holes there when you pressure him up against the ropes, but he's handling it a little bit better. I've seen that in his last fight against overall that of Anderson Silva. And once again, a lot of people, they love to talk all this shit about how Jake Paul, he's not really doing anything. Keep in mind that there was a Russian doctor, I believe overall by the name of Dr. Mike, or all in all, I believe that, he was a Russian doctor. And he ended up facing an MMA fighter. Keep in mind that Jake Paul fought former champions. Keep in mind also that, of course, these former champions, they were in their 40s or damn near close. In Anderson Silva and Tyron Woodley, of course. We all know that. But keep in mind that there was a YouTuber by the name of Dr. Mike overall that recently overall tried to fight an MMA fighter that was never ever looked at as a good MMA fighter by the name of Chris Avila, or Avila, I believe his name, however you personally pronounce it. One of Nate Diaz's crewmates, I believe. If I'm wrong about that, someone correct me. If you look up his MMA record is 8 wins and 9 losses. And when Dr. Mike got in there, Dr. Mike proceeded to get his ass kicked for every single one of those rounds. All 4 of those rounds when it came down to it. So a certain amount of people take a look at it and they say, well, what Jake Paul is doing, anybody could do. No, I'm sorry, I can't agree with that. How many of us, especially average Joes, or even certain people that are experienced in the boxing gym, unless you went to a very decent amateur circuit or you fought a little bit pro, how many of us can actually say that they can beat former MMA fighters, even in a boxing match like that of an Anderson Silva or a Tyron Woodley, even with a little bit of older age? How many of us could actually truly say that? Not many. So that's why I have to say, I have to give Jake Paul a little bit of credit here. Because for what he was once upon a time viewed being, a lot of people once upon a time said, okay, this is pretty much going to be a joke. He's pretty much not going to last. His boxing career is going to last for about 2 seconds. And now take a look. He's been able to beat Tyron Woodley. He's been able to beat Anderson Silva. But of course, this fight right here, in my opinion, is hands down the biggest test of his career. Now, certain people, of course, they may not necessarily agree with that. But in my opinion, Tommy Fury very clearly is going to be the biggest fight of his career. And once again, like I said, I have to give Jake Paul a decent amount of credit so far with what he's been able to do. Because Jake Paul, once again, with the fighters that he's been able to beat, as once again, go ahead, watch Dr. Mike's fight, or that one Russian doctor that went to fight Chris Avila, or whatever the hell his name was. He ended up getting his ass kicked for all 4 rounds. Now, one could argue that, well, Jake Paul, he's been trained a little bit more, that he's been overall in boxing a little bit longer, because even before they were professional boxers, I believe that the Paul brothers, that they were known to spar in boxing before. So one could certainly argue that they're a little bit more experienced, but I cannot agree that what Jake Paul has done, that anyone can do. No, I can't agree with that. It just is what it is. But Tommy Fury, in my opinion, clearly is going to be the biggest test of Mr. Jake Paul's career. It's going to be a very particularly interesting fight because Tommy Fury is going to be the first professional boxer, actual professional boxer, that Jake Paul has ever personally fought in his professional boxing career. Now, certain people may ask me the question, well, how good do you personally believe Tommy Fury actually is? Do you think all in all that he actually is going to beat up Jake Paul? Do you believe that he's an A-grade fighter. What do you personally believe? Because a lot of people, of course, do not believe that Tommy Fury is really that, great of a fighter. And I certainly understand it. He does have certain holes in his game. He's not a Tyson Fury. I think all in all that's very clear. But he does come from a very rich boxing background. Now, whether that's going to put more pressure on Tommy or whether that's going to give him more confidence, we'll see that tomorrow. But at the end of the day, Tommy Fury does come from a rich boxing background. And I will say this, with what I've seen of Tommy Fury, with some of his fights, even in some of the fights where I've seen him have a little bit more problems with certain opponents, and understandably he's not beaten certain fighters that have had the best records, all that is understandable. But just with certain techniques and with certain traps and with certain things that he's able to do overall in the boxing ring, I can already tell that he's going to be more than likely a bigger threat than what a Tyron Woodley or an Anderson Silva were. Because their striking and their footwork and their head movement, especially in a boxing match, is just not going to compete with someone that has actually been trained in the art of professional boxing. Because your head has to move overall basically on a swivel. You have to use your lead hand a lot of the times. And when you take a look at MMA fighters, there are certain ones that use their lead hand pretty decently well, but there's also a lot of them that don't use it quite as much. A lot of them also fight taller. Their footwork is also not correct overall in terms of boxing. It can be a little bit more clunky, or it's not in the right positioning. When I take a look at Tommy Fury, in my opinion, he clearly is the biggest threat so far to Jake Paul's career. He overall is a person that can use his lead hand and his reach very decently well. Now, he does get hit overall in certain areas, and he does need to move his head and move off on certain angles, but I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But what I will say is this, once again, the improvements with Jake Paul that I've seen within his past couple of fights, I am somewhat decently impressed with what he's been able to do, because he's been able to use that lead hand overall very decently well, which is something that every up-and-comer in boxing should be able to learn to do, to use their lead hand in a multitude of ways, not just overall to out-jab the opponent, but to use it to set up traps, to stick it in their face, to be something of a deflector, and something overall to set up certain traps or to blind their opponent, or to overall just keep it in their face to bother them. You can basically use your lead hand for a dozen different type of things. And Jake Paul, I'm not going to say that he's a master of it, but for the little amount of time that he's been in the boxing ring with his professional career, I am decently impressed with what he's been able to do with it. Setting up certain right hands and setting up overall certain left hooks and setting up overall certain other punches as well, or at least overall with the lead jab, setting up certain right hands or setting up other traps. Jake Paul is very clear once again that he does have a little bit of boxing IQ and that he has a little bit of boxing talent that the majority of other people out there that they just don't have. And I see once again a lot of average people or average Joes, they always talk shit or they talk in the comment section and they say, oh, put me in the ring with this guy, I would kick his ass. No, you wouldn't. Because Jake Paul, once again, whether people want to admit it or not, and I understand their personalities can come off as abrasive when it comes down to it, but at the end of the day, Jake Paul somewhat knows what he's doing. What I'm going to say is this, I've certainly seen worse people in the boxing gyms overall with the boxing gyms that I've been in or seen overall when it comes down to it. And I've even seen worse professional boxers than what Jake Paul has been. So it just is what it is. So a lot of people, once again, they like to talk all this shit and say overall that, oh, anyone can do what Jake Paul can do. No, that's not true. However, once again, what I will say is this Tommy Fury fight is going to be clearly the biggest, toughest fight so far of his career. And that's why I think, all in all, that it is so particularly interesting. Both of these fighters somewhat know how to use their lead hand. But Tommy Fury, in my opinion, he more than likely is going to be the stronger of the two. He's going to have a 4-inch reach advantage over that of Jake Paul from what I remember. He's going to have the richer history and more than likely a little bit more experience in that of terms of boxing. Of course, he is a part of one of the best fighting families out there of the Furies, especially with Tyson Fury being possibly in his corner. And in my opinion, the fight of who the winner is going to be, it's really going to be about who is not afraid as much of the other fighters' punches and who is less afraid of getting hit and who's really willing to put their offense out more. Because both of these people, in my opinion, they're a little bit hittable. When I take a look at Jake Paul, especially if you pressure him up against the ropes, you can get some hits in off him. We've seen that against Tyron Woodley. We've seen that against Anderson Silva. He is handling it better. He is tying up better, and he is overall handling certain things better. He's keeping his hands up more and overall, getting a much better defense up against the ropes, but you still can put him in a little bit of trouble, especially if you're going to put a lot of pressure on him. And Tommy Fury does have a decent amount of power. That's not me saying that he's the most powerful man ever, but against Jake Paul, this is going to be a very rough fight for him, in my opinion, if Tommy Fury does not have anxiety issues in this fight and if he just calms and cools his mind. But we'll see overall what ends up happening with that. He may not be a Tyson Fury. Certain guys, they're able to cool and calm their mind. Other guys are not going to be able to. So we're going to truly see overall who maybe has more anxiety issues, because who has more anxiety issues within this fight, that is going to be the loser of this fight. This is, in my opinion, a fight that truly could go either way. And if Tommy Fury has too many anxiety issues and is afraid of Jake Paul's power early on, and he does have decent power, if he's afraid of his power early on, and vice versa, if Jake Paul is afraid of Tommy Fury's power very early on, in my opinion, it can be a very long 8 rounds for whoever ends up pretty much utilizing their game plan and their punches better. But one thing I'll say is this: for Tommy Fury, if I were going to give him advice, I would say try to utilize your lead hand, which he does usually pretty decently well. Overall, try to get that right hand in there. Also, try to attack Jake Paul's body quite frequently. Jake Paul, especially against a lot of MMA fighters, from what I noticed, MMA fighters, I'm not saying that they don't attack the body, but they don't usually attack the body quite as often, especially with punches. Overall, understandably, because sometimes they can get hit with certain things that boxers are not used to. But try to get Jake Paul with a very decent body attack, because I don't know if Jake Paul has really experienced that type of storm as of yet. He's experienced certain MMA fighters trying to push him up against the ropes or trying to get clear headshots on him. But a lot of faults about MMA fighters, especially versus boxers, is that, in my opinion, a lot of them, they don't really do enough body work. Tommy Fury, he does do a little bit of body work. And if you do put Jake Paul up against on the ropes, use your lead hand to basically put him in place and overall, keep him there. And on top of that, when it comes down to it, do a vicious body attack. Throw some hooks in there. Throw a right hand up top. Try to get some uppercuts in there. Tie him up if you need to. Try to roughhouse him in there. You're going to make him more than likely a little bit uncomfortable. As my advice for Jake Paul, what more than likely I would advise for him is that when Tommy Fury tries to stick his lead hand in your face, watch out for the incoming right cross, possibly to the body or to the head overall. And you may have to hit him with certain angles. You may have to move off on a certain angle, because one of the weaknesses that I see in Tommy Fury's game is that Tommy Fury is not always great at avoiding certain shots, especially inside the range. He keeps his head a little bit too stiff, in my opinion, and at times he doesn't really use his feet quite as often as what he needs to. His footwork doesn't come across to me as the worst that I've ever seen, but he doesn't really move off back and forth as what he truly needs to, like a fighter like what a Dmitry Bivol would do, or a Vasily Lomachenko. When you take a look at those certain fighters, or usually the best of fighters, they can move in and out to avoid and get in certain counters, to avoid certain counters and avoid certain punches, but also to get in certain counters. Tommy Fury is not necessarily the best at that. I've seen him in a couple of fights, and overall there were certain times where he got countered a lot with a good right or with a good left hook, or a good overhand right or a good right hook. And Jake Paul, his favorite punch seems to be that good little overhand right. He also has a very good left hook. So if Tommy Fury gets intimidated by that early, it could be a very long night, an embarrassing night for him. So we'll see what ends up happening there. So that would be pretty much my advice for both fighters. Both fighters are going to have to utilize a body attack early, in my opinion. Both fighters are going to have to utilize their lead hand. But in my opinion, if you had to ask me, who do I personally believe is going to win the fight? I believe that the fight is about 8 rounds. Well, unless there is a very, very bad decision or something like that, in my view, I believe that Tommy Fury more than likely is going to be the victor in the fight. And some people, once again, they disagree. I've seen certain analysts like Paulie Malignaggi, for example, who a lot of the times, in my view, is a very good analyst. And he personally stated that he actually believed that Anderson Silva was a bigger threat than that of Tommy Fury. Do I personally agree with that? No, I don't. Because for the first time, Jake Paul is actually going to get in there with somewhat of boxing experience. This is a guy that knows how to utilize his lead hand, just like Jake Paul was able to utilize over that of the MMA fighters that he fought. When it came down to it, this is a guy that also knows how to set up certain traps. This is also a guy that's going to have a 4-inch reach advantage over him, and is 23 years old and a very decent athlete, and comes from a rich boxing family. Now, once again, that doesn't always mean everything. Just because you come from a rich boxing family doesn't always mean that you're going to be a great fighter. But Jake Paul, once again, no one really takes a look at him and says, wow, that's a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter in boxing. So, once again, we'll see what happens. But in my view, I'm going to go with Tommy Fury overall by that of decision. Once again, I give Jake Paul a lot of credit for what he's been able to do throughout his career so far, because he's shown a lot of grit, he's shown a lot of toughness, in my opinion. You don't necessarily have to like the events, but in my opinion, Jake Paul does deserve a certain amount of respect with what he's been able to do. With the lead hand and with the defense and with certain movements and at times a shoulder roll when it comes down to it, Jake Paul has shown that he has somewhat of boxing intelligence, more than most people. Now, once again, he's not a Canelo Alvarez, he's not a Terrence Bud Crawford. But at the end of the day, he certainly has more boxing ability and boxing IQ than what most people you would see in the boxing gym or even other certain professional fighters out there. Period. Point blank. It just is what it is. Is it going to be enough, in my opinion, to beat Tommy Fury? We'll see. Like I said, both of these men, they're going to really have to risk it to get the biscuit in this fight, because both of these men are going to get hit in the fight. Period. Point blank. Jake Paul, even though he has gotten hit in the past, I don't know if he's going to get quite as much overall easy as what he is going to get in this fight, because before he was able to handle some very rough hits, like against that of Anderson Silva and that against Tyron Woodley. Tommy Fury, in my opinion, more than likely with his reach and overall with some of the stuff that he's able to do. Now, once again, Tommy Fury is not necessarily a Canelo Alvarez or a Terrence Bud Crawford either, but he knows how to utilize certain things and throw when he needs to. That's why I'm going to go with the Tommy Fury by a unanimous or a split decision. But I would not be shocked overall if the fight went either way. And if Jake Paul does end up winning this fight, I do have to give him even a greater respect. Because, of course, he was able to beat the first professional boxer. And in my opinion, not a great professional boxer, but a decent professional boxer, one that's on the come up. But I have to go with Tommy Fury in this fight by unanimous decision. I wouldn't really be surprised if it was 5-3, 4-4. I wouldn't be surprised that the fight went really either way. But I'm going with Tommy Fury. I'm going to say more than likely that he wins about 5-3, 6-2, but it will heavily depend on, once again, in my opinion, how comfortable and overall if he lets the anxiety or the pressure get to him. Because all the pressure, in my opinion, in this fight, it is on Tommy Fury, or at least a lot of it is. So it's going to be very particularly interesting. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.